So welcome back to part 2 of our tour of the Australian Cruiser Mark I Sentinel. Of course, everybody's favorite, inside. And this is a small tank, so I'm sure you'll be doubtless amused. Before we get going on the crew positions, however, just one point to note. You'll recall in part 1, on the right-hand side of the turret, I found some chutes that I had speculated were likely for shell casings from the coaxial machine gun. Turns out, no. The other end of the chute is this slot up here that's covered by mesh. And I've seen this on other Sentinels as well, and I just thought it was a periscope mounting that they just put a mesh into place. No. This is actually a chute. You put stuff down here and it falls out on the side of the turret, on the whole side. I have absolutely no idea why you would want to do such a thing or why you would actually build such a thing into your tank turret. And neither does anybody else I've been asking around here. So if you have any ideas, please add them to the bottom of the YouTube video. Or if I find out from the Aussies, or I'll give them a call, I guess, I'll upload a little annotation. But for now, I am completely flummoxed as to why they have invented this chute that just sits in there. Anyway, so back to the turret. 3-man crew, commander, obviously I'm in his hatch right now, the gunner is seated to his front, and the loader gets all the rooms on the right. Commander's hatch, a very simple 2-piece affair, split hatch forwards and backwards. The cupola does rotate a little bit, it's kind of locked in position right now. There are periscopes, 1 forward and 1 rear. This is all he gets to look at with. And frankly, it's pretty abysmal. Still, again, early 40s, a lot of tanks didn't have great visibility. But you kind of hope for more. His seat, he stands on a fully upholstered seat. It does swivel for reasons which are completely beyond me. I don't see why you would want to swivel your commander's seat because there's not really any room to swivel to. Still, there is nothing out here. There is the wireless antenna, and that is it. So let's go inside. Okay, so we come down into the TC seat, and I'm going to give you the heads up right now. This is probably one of the worst turret interiors I've ever been in, and you remember I've been in Matilda. I am currently seated in what appears to be the only position that the commander can be seated, and that's facing more or less to the turret's 2 o'clock, 2 to 2:30. So front of the tank is actually that way right now. The reason is because of the proximity of the gunner's seat to my direct front. We'll come back to that in a moment. So otherwise, what does he have? He's got obviously the 2 periscopes, front and rear. They have armored shutters, so these levers would raise and lower the armored shutters. To his right, he has controls for the 2 wireless sets, 2 wireless settings, wireless A and B. And the actual wireless itself is a number 19, and it fits in the turret bustle just above the water tank. The water tank is filled up by use of this little port here. Yes, it actually is water to drink, and by the way, also for cooling the machine guns, but officially this is drinking water. And there's other assorted stowage around as well. But generally speaking, he has no particular controls, and he has no particular room. So for as much as possible, especially given that the periscopes really are inadequate, he's as well off standing up and fighting unbuttoned. While we're here, I'll also point out that this is a fully basketed turret, but it does have plenty of room available for us to access the engine compartment. There is a large access panel. It appears to have a sliding door, so you can close off kind of like a firewall between the engine compartment and the rest of the hull. But I don't actually see the door part of it, but you see the rails for it. Also directly beneath me and against the firewall are the gauges for the engine pressures for the 3 engines. And if you're going to do basic maintenance on the 2 engines nearest you, you can also access them through here, through the turret basket, And also there are clutches. So each engine can be declutched from the transfer case. So let's say you can access the 2 clutches here for the 1 and 3 engine and leave the number 2 connected to the propeller shaft if there's a problem, for example, with the other 2 engines. Okay, so I've moved forward to the gunner's seat, and this is quite impossible. I have reserved a special level of hatred for the Panzer 38T because of the god-awfulness of the internal crew configuration. This is worse. This is far worse. As you can see, I am seated exactly to the 3 o'clock position. So in order to aim in the sight, I would have to put my head forward like this and fight basically 90 degrees to where I am. Now, you could argue that in normal use with power traverse only, yeah, you could go kind of forward, but you want to make very sure that the gear is disconnected if it can be disconnected. The manual seems a bit unclear on the point, because otherwise it's going to come around and take your leg off. And this is not a case of me being tall. This is a case of you could put a 10-year-old kid in here and he would not have room. So what does the gunner actually have? Well, I guess we'll start at the left and work around. So firstly, he's got a couple of stowage boxes here and there. He's well-equipped stowage boxes. There is a vision slit forward and left. It's right through the mantlet. There's a lever that you pull that opens up the vision slit. Fantastic in theory. In actuality, I can't even get the lever to point to the lever, let alone actually lever it. And how you're supposed to put your head in such a position that you can actually see anything is completely beyond me, because the stowage box is in the way and it's pulled into place. Near as I can tell, all you do is you open up the lever and you might get a little bit more light inside the tank, otherwise it's pointless. The traverse controller is both powered or manual traverse. It is a wheel that you kind of spin around a little bit. I guess call it a steering wheel if you want, or a rudder wheel. It is an electrical system. It runs on a 40-volt motor, and the generator for the motor is located under the turret basket. The generator takes the power takeoff of the transfer case that the 3 engines went into, which means that if the engines aren't running, you have no electricity to traverse the turret. It's not connected to the battery system at all. Your next problem is that because the engine isn't always at constant speed, you have a variation on the amount of voltage that the generator is pumping out to your 40-volt motor. As a result, there are 2 shunt motors inside as well to stabilize, I guess, the voltage. The manual goes into its peculiarities about how there is, a 3rd shunt motor attached to the reversing motor for the controller. I understood absolutely none of it. I'm not an electrician. Maybe an electrician can read it and actually make sense of it. But suffice to say, power traverse. Down further and to the right is the manual traverse, which, as you can see, is maybe 6 inches forward and 2 inches above my seat. Completely and totally in the way if you have your legs forward. Next to the right, you have the gun itself. So the gun is a 2-pounder. Australian manufacturer. It has a very distinctive step shape to it instead of the usual smooth taper. Free elevation, so the manual actually shows the shoulder pad, which doesn't seem to be here, but there's no gearing or anything else. And there are 2 really big handles way down low. I mean, we're talking maybe 1.5 feet off of the turret basket floor. And you would grip those. There are 2 triggers, one on the left, one on the right. Presumably one is a coax, one is a main gun. And I'm honestly trying to figure out how they were expected to fight with 2 hands on the trigger and nothing on the traverse mechanism, or 1 and 1 at what's sort of a terrible contortion you got to go through to actually operate this tank. It was, no. The gun itself, so the 2-pounder as mentioned, Australian manufacturer, no nickel involved in production. For its time in 1940 or so, the 2-pounder was a pretty good tank gun. By 1942, when the first one of these things was made, it was really starting to show its age. And by the time the production of the AC-1 was completed, the tank was all but useless on the modern battlefield. The only saving grace was that the tanks it was expected to go up against most likely are such as the one directly in front of it in this museum, a Japanese tank, which calling that a tank is also a little bit generous given the amount of armor it has. So that is it for the gunner's position. He has no optics other than his telescope, the direct vision telescope. The manual does show a periscope above him, but there is not one on this turret. I don't seem to recall there being one on the other Sentinel I was on a couple of weeks ago. So it may have been a very late production modification, or it may have been even deleted from production. I don't think I've really quite gotten across how bad this turret is. And I hate to say it because I really want to like Sentinel. It's just such I like obscure and I like odd. But there's no way I can say this is a well-designed, adequate turret. And the other thing is, it's such a big turret compared to some of the other two-pounder turrets that are out there. But this is far and away worse than the Toby. Loader next. Okay, so getting over to the loader side was actually made easier by the fact that the recoil guard folds up and out of the way. To come to the right of the two-pounder, you have the mounting point for the coaxial machine gun. It is a Vickers 303. Yes, the big, huge, you can fire this thing all day as long as you got the ammunition Vickers. Of course, it is huge. It is also water-cooled, which means that you need to have a water cooling system. And that's these pipes, which run along to a water pump down here, which circulates the water through the main reservoir for the Vickers, which is located, of course, you fill it up here. Ammunition is the two-pounder ammunition is not very big, so this is the ready rack. I should point out that the ammunition that my right shoulder, right elbow is on is actually a hull ammunition stowage. Most of the ammunition was in the hull, which for some reason has been unbolted and placed up into the turret. Lastly, there is the tap, or faucet, I guess, depending on where you're from, where you can get your nice cup of refreshing, probably quite warm water. So that is pretty much it for the turret interior of Sentinel, and I'm going to be quite glad to get out of this. People ask me, Subby, how do you avoid bashing your head in a confined space like this? I mean, I'm a big guy in terms of height, and my head's going to hit things. Right? You kind of, after a while, you develop a sixth sense that my head is about to hit something. I don't know if it's come across in the video, but my head has been screaming, "You're going to hit something! You're going to hit something!" pretty much the entire duration of this filming, and that's probably saying something. Because, as I say, I've been in some pretty cramped tanks, and yeah, this one does not make grade. All right, so we're going out of the turret, thankfully. We're going to go forward into the hull. Two positions here, the hull gunner and the driver. We're going to go hull gunner first. The hatches are, well, I've seen worse. Comet and T-34 come to mind, but they don't exactly look big. Let's just hop into it anyway and see how we do. It's not so bad. As soon as I say that. Okay, there we go. Wonderful. All right, so once I'm actually in the hull gunner's position, I don't know if I'd want to stay here very long, but it's not bad. The seat does adjust a little bit. To see out, as per the driver, he's got a periscope forward, which is adjustable in elevation and should rotate, but it's frozen solid in this case. He does have an armored visor, which is manually open and closed. There's little slits in it just in case, because he's got another armored visor to the left that he can fully open. And finally, his job, of course, as the hull gunner, as his designation, is the hull machine gun. Again, a water-cooled 303 Vickers, excellent sustained fire weapon. And the reason it could sustain fire was because of the water. The water tank in this case, we already saw one for the loader, is located to his left. The motor for the pump is directly to his front, and then it loops around the two pipes that enter on the right-hand side of the gun. The gun mount itself, he has no optics, so the only thing he can do to aim is watch his tracer through the periscope. The armored housing is very heavy. Unlike your air-cooled machine guns, like a Besa, let's say on the British tank, which has nothing to protect. The water jacket for the Vickers needs protection against shrapnel. So they have the armored housing on the front of the hull that everybody talks about. It bears resemblance to various parts of anatomy. To counteract the weight of the armored housing, in addition to simply the sheer weight of the Vickers machine gun, they also have a counterweight on the bottom. The housing is held in place, or the entire machine gun is held in place by a series of locks. So there's a lock for traverse and there is a lock for elevation. And it's a very simple lock. You just unscrew it, and all of a sudden your gun is now able to adjust in elevation or traverse. That's really all there is in the hull gunner's position. I do note that if they were nice enough to put some now flaking foam, because the way the hull is cast, there's otherwise a great big rib, I guess, which will catch the back of his head. It should be noted that floor plates are actually bolted. They're thin sheet metal finish, bolted to the cast hull. So the floor is not actually part of the hull. Anyway, so that's it for here, and next to driver. And lastly, the driver's seat on the right-hand side. Of course, Australia is a right-hand drive country. First observations, it's not as bad as the turret, which is sort of damning by faint praise. Getting in and out of the hatch is small enough that if you get in, shall we say, facing to the rear for whatever reason, because it's easier to climb down, you don't have enough room to spin around. Getting out, I can only imagine, in a hurry is difficult. You will get knocked. What's worse is that because the hatch is open, split sideways, the armored housing for the turret 303 actually blocks one half of the driver's hatch from opening all the way. There is a couple of stops on it, so it'll open about the 2/3 position, but I would argue this is still unsatisfactory. To his left is the gearbox transmission. The story of the transmission is a great saga in and of itself. So the problem was, again, you had 400 horse in theory coming to the transmission, but there was no transmission made in Australia at the time capable of handling that level of power. So solutions, what were they? Well, one solution was to simply buy M3 medium gearboxes off the Americans. Well, the problem was that the Americans were using them all because they were building them as fast as possible for the British. And indeed the Americans, because they only had M2s. So the next solution was, well, can we just get the plans for the things and we'll build them ourselves? Sure, says the Americans. They ship over the plans. And the Australian engineers look at it and they realize that it is too advanced. The Australians simply can't make it. They don't have the equipment. So can we get the tooling to make it? Sure, says the Americans. They'll be available by maybe March 42, or middle of 42, and still not fast enough. The next proposed solution was, well, if we just can't get a 400 horsepower gearbox, what we should do is get a gearbox that's as powerful as we can and then reduce the engine power accordingly. So they developed the plan for a Sentinel with only 2 of the Cadillac engines. This is called AC2. It's going to be a bit smaller, a bit lighter, and in theory, the loss of one engine wouldn't be quite as bad. That was a stillborn project. They gave up on it. Finally, they made a transmission of their own. It is a crash gearbox. No fancy synchro mesh here. So double clutching is the order of the day. Gear shift is on the left-hand side, the clutch is, of course, as you would expect, on the pedal. It's, I'm not going to say comfortably placed, but you can get to it. As you go around, the rev counter is a sort of a strange needle system. It's not your usual round tack. There are oil pressure, the speedometer is up here, it's got 232 miles on the clock. Periscope for buttoned up vision. He has the armored visor in the closed position right now. To his front, he has the panel. There are 3 engines on this thing, so as a result, 3 of everything. There's, okay, so we got the lights, that's different, but there's 3 ignition switches, there's 3 starter switches, it's only 1 emergency start. Up here is a push button for the manual fire extinguisher. So there are 2 methyl bromide fire extinguishers in the engine compartment. Push button, they go off. They also have automatic sensors. If the temperature sensors, there are 8 of them in the engine compartment, any of them trip over 480 degrees Fahrenheit, fire extinguisher goes off. Neat feature for the time. And of course at the bottom you got 3 amperage gauges for the generators. You got 3 temperature gauges. Of course the oil pressure gauges were at the rear of the vehicle. Steering conducted again by 2 tillers, as you would expect. They also performed as the brake. The manual did request, if as much as possible, to use rolling friction to stop the tank more than the brakes themselves. I guess they didn't want to go through the hassle of changing them. It was a bit inconvenient. It is a fixed radius steering. The minimum turning diameter was 58 feet, which actually was pretty good by the standards of the time. Sherman was a little bit more, if I recall correctly, closer to 70. Now, of course, having 3 engines, it does mean that you have a little element of redundancy. So should an engine go down, you just manually declutch it. There is a clutch in between the engine itself and the transfer case. And similarly, if you have a dead starter, what you can do is you can start the other engines by declutching the dead engine, rev them up, and then drop the clutch on the dead engine, which would spin it into life. Of course, everybody wants to know how fast the tank will go. The speedometer goes up as far as 40, but yeah, it's, as usual, it's kind of optimistic. In actuality, the top speed listed in the manual is 24 miles an hour forward in 5th gear, and maximum speed in reverse, 3. So that's it, that was Sentinel. I have to say it was, I don't know if love it or hate it. I mean, for the challenge that the Australians undertook, you gotta love it, but after having been inside one, and obviously today was the first time I've ever done so, yeah, not so much. It was probably just as well that they only built about 63 of the things. The problem was that they never really managed to work out all the kinks. There were problems particularly with the cooling and the wireless installation. And this is not unexpected. Remember, this is a country that has never built a tank before and is all of a sudden trying to build a first-rate cruiser. Even the experienced tank manufacturers were churning out dogs that needed a lot of work, such as Cromwell, such as Pershing, before they became reasonable tanks. There were further developments. So most of the tanks that were built were the AC-1 with the 2-pounder. After a while, it was realized that you needed something with a little bit bigger punch than the 2-pounder, and the only other gun that was in manufacture in Australia at the time was a 25-pounder. It was more of an artillery piece than a gun, but it did do dual service in North Africa and had a reasonable armor-piercing round. Certainly better than the 2-pounder, and by the way, you also had a high explosive effect, which is very useful for a tank. The problem was that the 25-pounder and the ammunition was so big that you had to get rid of the machine guns for stowage and just room for the main gun. And a tank with no machine guns, well, this is bad for a tank. So that didn't go very far. The next option was the AC-4, which is basically take the AC-3 turret, you stick a 17-pounder into it. Well, first you got to test it, so they stuck 2 25-pounders side by side, pulled the trigger at the same time to see if the turret would take the recoil, and yes, it did. So in goes the 17-pounder, and I have no idea how on earth that was supposed to be a serviceable weapon. I mean, it was tight in the Firefly. The 2-pounder is tight in this thing. Granted, it was a smaller turret than the Mark IV, but still. Then you had the issue that the war had changed for the Australians. They were no longer fighting in the open terrain in North Africa. They were now focusing on the Japanese. And a 17-pounder against a Japanese tank would probably just go in one side out the other and do no damage. Then you had the problem that, well, Australia doesn't have many resources to begin with. They only had a population of 7 million. And you have all the railway workers now trying to make tanks. They weren't working on the railways. The railways were beginning to suffer. So the Australians had a sort of a come to Jesus moment, shall we say. And they had a good look at where their resources should be going. Now, at this time, the British had finally started delivering Matildas, about 200 on order. The Americans were churning out M3 mediums and M3 lights by the hundreds and shipping them to Australia. Plus, anywhere that the Australians were going to fight, they were going to fight with likely the Americans or the British, and they did not use Sentinels. So the Australians would have to bring their own new set of spares just for their own Australia-specific tank. It just wasn't worth it. The production was stopped, as I say, at about 63. The main battle tank of the Australian forces became the M3 medium and then the M4 medium. The Matildas, of course, were very popular in East Asia as well. And that was basically the end of the story of Sentinel, except for the 6 or so that remain. The one here in Bovington, the 2 in Cairns, one in Puckapunyal, one at the War Memorial in Canberra, and there is an AC3 in private hands somewhere. The owner's name eludes me. So that's it. You want to see a Sentinel? You either got to go to Australia or you come here to the UK, Bovington Tank Museum. Hope you enjoyed the tour. I'll see you when I see you. One last thing, remember those oval panels on the hull side that couldn't figure out what they were because they were welded in place? Well, it turns out they were originally escape hatches. Rather badly designed escape hatches, my guess is that they were deemed to be more trouble than they were worth, and they just welded them over.